The morning in Tampa, Florida was a bit more humid than usual. Elizabeth Clark squinted at the morning sunlight streaming through her bedroom window as she checked the alarm clock on her nightstand. 6:30 a.m. She took a deep breath and slowly closed her eyes again. Just 5 more minutes. But her wish would not be granted. She heard light, quick footsteps in the hallway approaching her door. "Mom, are you up? Breakfast is ready." The door opened and her 13-year-old daughter Katie peeked in. Her hair was tied back in a ponytail, and she already looked energetic so early in the morning. Elizabeth smiled at the sight of her daughter. "Good morning, Katie. You're up early today." "That's because I have my special project presentation at school today. Did you forget?" Elizabeth hurriedly sat up. "I'm sorry, I completely forgot. I'll get ready right away." Elizabeth had been working as an editor at the major publishing house, Atlantic Press, for over 10 years. Her specialty was educational books and literature for young adults. Her work was demanding, but she managed to balance it with raising her daughter Katie as a single mother. When she went downstairs to the kitchen, toast, eggs, and orange juice were waiting. "Did you make this?" Elizabeth asked in surprise. "Yes. I practiced making breakfast for my cooking homework. What do you think? Does it look edible?" Katie looked at her mother with expectant eyes. "Of course. It looks delicious." Elizabeth gently stroked her daughter's head. While eating breakfast, Elizabeth recalled her divorce 3 years ago. Her marriage to Richard Clark had been happy for the first few years. He was a talented cardiac surgeon, nationally renowned especially in the field of pediatric cardiac surgery. They had met at a charity event at a university hospital and married a year later. Katie was born soon after. However, as Richard's reputation grew, he became increasingly devoted to his work. He stayed at the hospital until late at night and was increasingly called away for emergency surgeries on weekends. Even when he was home, he was always either reading medical journals or preparing for his next surgery. He was a wonderful doctor. But as a husband, as a father. Elizabeth sighed. "Mom, what are you thinking about?" Katie's voice brought her back to reality. "Oh, nothing. Are you nervous about your presentation today?" She changed the subject. "A little. But I'm fully prepared," Katie answered cheerfully. Elizabeth felt saved by her daughter's brightness. The divorce hadn't been easy, but she was determined to live positively for Katie's sake. After the divorce, the court gave Elizabeth custody of Katie, and Richard was granted visitation rights once a month on weekends and the right to spend 2 weeks with Katie during summer vacation. Richard lived in an upscale residential area of Tampa and worked at the prestigious St. Joseph Children's Hospital. His 7-figure annual income provided generous child support that financially sustained Elizabeth and Katie. "Is Dad coming to see me this weekend too?" Katie suddenly asked. Elizabeth thought for a moment before answering. "Yes, according to the schedule. Dad is writing an important research paper right now, but he said he would take you to the aquarium on Saturday." "Yay! I've been wanting to see the new dolphin show." Elizabeth smiled. Richard might have been too dedicated to his work, but she had to admit that he truly loved Katie. He always gave Katie expensive gifts and tried to spend quality time with her whenever possible. Recently, he had given her the latest tablet for her 13th birthday. "Oh, I meant to tell you," Elizabeth continued after taking a sip of coffee. "I have to go on a business trip to Chicago next week." "Chicago? For how long?" There was a hint of worry in Katie's expression. "Just for 4 days. But since it coincides with your spring break, would you like to come with me? There's a big aquarium there, and we can also take a cruise on Lake Michigan." Katie's face brightened. "Really? Can I go?" "Of course. We can do some sightseeing between my meetings." I'll be discussing a new children's book series, Explorer Macy, a story about a girl who goes on adventures around the world. That's awesome. Should I tell Dad? Elizabeth thought for a moment. Yes, I'll call him tonight. We need to make sure it doesn't conflict with his weekend plans. Thanks, Mom. Katie jumped up and hugged her mother. They hurriedly finished getting ready, and Elizabeth dropped Katie off at school before heading to the publishing house. At the office, she had detailed meetings about the Chicago trip. The chief editor, Martha Johnson, stopped Elizabeth. Elizabeth, do you have all the materials for the Chicago meeting? Author Christina Williams is looking forward to it. Yes, everything's ready. Actually, I'm thinking of taking my daughter along. It's her spring break. That's wonderful. It will be a good experience for your daughter, Martha smiled kindly. That evening, on her way home, Elizabeth stopped at the supermarket to buy ingredients for dinner. When she arrived home, Katie had already started her homework. How was it? The presentation? Elizabeth asked. It was great. My teacher and friends all praised me. Can I start packing for the trip tomorrow? Elizabeth laughed. There's still a week to go. But sure, let's make a list of what we'll need tomorrow. After dinner, as promised, Elizabeth called Richard. He responded as concisely as usual. Chicago? That's fine. I'll change my schedule. But when Katie comes back, I want to increase her violin lessons. She has talent. Elizabeth agreed. Understood. But make sure she doesn't get too tired. After hanging up, Elizabeth sat on the sofa and sighed. Conversations with Richard were always tense, but she needed to maintain a cooperative relationship for her daughter's sake. Plans for the Chicago trip proceeded smoothly, and Elizabeth and Katie gathered everything they needed. They were both sincerely looking forward to this little adventure. Elizabeth felt her heart flutter with excitement at the prospect of traveling alone with her daughter for the first time in a long while. The departure day for Chicago dawned. The morning was a bit chilly, and Tampa's sky was covered with pale gray clouds. Elizabeth closed her suitcase zipper while doing a final check. Katie, are you ready? The taxi will be here soon. Just a minute, her daughter's voice echoed from upstairs. Elizabeth looked out the living room window. After her divorce from Richard, she had moved to a quiet residential area in the suburbs of Tampa. The garden was small, but there was a little pond at the back where the morning sun beautifully reflected off the water's surface. It was a peaceful place to live. A few minutes later, Katie came downstairs with a heavy backpack on her shoulder. Do you really need all that? Elizabeth asked with a laugh. Of course. Katie opened her backpack to show its contents. Tablet, charger, earphones, 3 books, sketchbook, colored pencil set, and... Okay, Elizabeth raised her hands in surrender. Just make sure you don't get bored on the plane. The taxi arrived, and they loaded their luggage into the trunk. On the way to Tampa International Airport, Katie talked enthusiastically about the places she wanted to see in Chicago. Elizabeth watched her daughter's excited face, hoping this trip would create good memories for both of them. Mom, is the Chicago Aquarium really bigger than the one in Tampa? Katie asked. Yes, Shedd Aquarium is one of the largest in America. It has over 32,000 species of marine life. Wow! So they have lizards and chameleons too? No, those reptiles would be at Lincoln Park Zoo, not the aquarium. I hope we can go there too. When they arrived at the airport, they loaded their luggage onto a cart and headed for the departure lobby. Elizabeth checked in using her smartphone and proceeded to the baggage drop counter. Your seats are adjacent in economy class, window and aisle, the woman at the counter said with a smile. Boarding begins at 11:30 from gate 23. Thank you. Elizabeth took the boarding passes and handed one to Katie. don't lose this. They checked their luggage and headed toward the security checkpoint. It was the morning rush hour, and there was a long line at the checkpoint. "Mom, I'm hungry," Katie murmured. "We'll get something to eat at the cafe near our gate after we pass through security," Elizabeth answered gently. "Just a little patience." 30 minutes later, it was finally their turn. Elizabeth removed her belt, took off her shoes, and placed her small items in a plastic tray. "Katie, take off your shoes and put them in the tray, and your belt too," Elizabeth said. "I know, Mom. This isn't my first time," Katie answered, sounding slightly annoyed. She expertly placed her backpack on the X-ray scanner's conveyor belt and put her shoes and jacket in another tray. Elizabeth went through the metal detector first and passed without incident. It was Katie's turn next. She walked through the metal detector arch. Suddenly, a shrill alarm sounded. "Oh!" Katie stopped, startled. A uniformed female TSA officer approached. Middle-aged with a stern expression, though her eyes were kind. "Are you wearing any metal?" the officer asked. "No, nothing," Katie shook her head. "Necklace or hair clips?" "I don't have anything," Katie answered, looking a bit anxious. The TSA officer seemed to ponder for a moment, then exchanged glances with a colleague. "Could you try going through once more, just to be sure?" Katie went through the metal detector again, but the alarm sounded again. "That's strange." Elizabeth frowned. "Katie, what about your pockets?" "There's nothing in them," Katie turned her pockets inside out to show. The TSA officer looked suspicious and made notes on her clipboard. "I'm sorry, but we'll need to conduct a body scan in a separate room," she said politely but firmly. The color drained from Katie's face. "Mom," she called in a small voice. "It's okay, Katie," Elizabeth said, trying to reassure her daughter. "There's nothing to worry about. I'll come with you." The TSA officer led them to a small separate room. There was a large X-ray scanning device and several monitors set up. "Please stand here, young lady," another female officer instructed. "Raise your arms slightly and stand with your feet shoulder-width apart." Katie looked at Elizabeth. Seeing her mother nod, she stood as instructed. "It's okay, this is a safe scan and will only take a few seconds," Elizabeth encouraged her daughter. The scanner activated, and a large machine rotated around Katie. It ended in about 20 seconds. "Please remain still while we check the images," the officer said. The monitor displayed an outline of a human body with the internal structure visible. As the TSA officer stared at the monitor, her expression suddenly changed. She hurriedly called over a colleague, and they began whispering to each other. Elizabeth began to feel uneasy. It was clear that something wasn't normal. "Is there a problem?" Elizabeth asked. Her voice trembled slightly. One of the officers turned back and answered, carefully choosing her words. "Mrs. Clark, there's something concerning on the monitor." She called Elizabeth to the monitor and pointed at the screen. "There appears to be a small metallic object embedded below your daughter's shoulder blade." Elizabeth gasped. Indeed, the screen showed a small rectangular object beneath Katie's right shoulder blade. It was about 2 centimeters in size and clearly artificial. "What is that?" Elizabeth asked in a trembling voice. "We don't know." "Is it a medical implant? Like a pacemaker or an insulin pump?" "No, my daughter has never had surgery," Elizabeth answered. Her heart began to race. "At least not that I know of." Katie was listening to their conversation with a confused look. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Just a moment, Katie," Elizabeth tried to calm her daughter while turning back to the TSA officer. "What is going on here?" "I'll call the senior security officer," the officer said and called someone on the intercom. A few minutes later, a man in a gray suit entered the room. He was in his mid-50s with short-cropped white hair and a stern expression. After a brief self-introduction, he immediately went to the monitor. "I'm Johnson, the senior security officer," he said concisely. He stared at the monitor for a while and pressed several buttons to enlarge the image. After a few minutes of tense silence, he looked at Elizabeth with a severe expression. "This appears to be some kind of tracking device. It would have been deliberately implanted," the security officer said with a stern look. "What?" Elizabeth repeated in disbelief. Her head spun, and she felt the room revolving around her. These kinds of devices transmit location information in real time. Someone can constantly monitor where your daughter is, who she's with, and how she's spending her time. You should report this to the police immediately. But how? Elizabeth was confused. How could something like that be in my daughter's body? This couldn't be implanted without professional medical intervention. It would have required a small surgery, probably under anesthesia. He looked at Katie and then turned back to Elizabeth. "Go to the police right away." Katie turned pale and looked at her mother with a frightened expression. "Mom, is there something inside me?" Elizabeth rushed to her daughter and hugged her tightly. "It's okay, Katie. Mom will take care of this." But her heart was filled with fear and anxiety. Who had implanted a tracking device in her daughter's body, why, and how? Her thoughts were chaotic, and her hands were shaking. "I'll escort you to the airport police office," Johnson said. "They'll handle this matter." Elizabeth nodded silently. She gathered their belongings and tightly held Katie's hand. Their plans for a fun trip to Chicago had collapsed, and a terrifying nightmare was about to begin instead. "I'm scared, Mom," Katie said in a thin voice. "I'll protect you," Elizabeth said firmly. But she too was trembling with fear. The airport police office was a small room characterized by impersonal walls and fluorescent lighting. Elizabeth and Katie sat on hard plastic chairs while two uniformed officers examined the X-ray photos at the desk in front of them. The air in the room was heavy and tense. "Mom, can't we get on the plane?" Katie asked in a small voice. Her blue eyes were wide with anxiety. "There are more important things right now," Elizabeth answered gently. But her own heart was also greatly disturbed. One of the officers, Detective Robert Mullins, turned toward them. He was a man in his mid-40s with kind eyes and a tired expression. "Mrs. Clark, this is clearly an illegal implant," he pointed to the X-ray photo. There, a small rectangular object was clearly visible beneath Katie's shoulder blade. "Does your daughter remember being subjected to any surgery? Is there anything she remembers?" Katie squeezed her mother's hand tightly. "No. I don't remember anything," she answered in a trembling voice. Elizabeth gently stroked her daughter's hair, desperately trying to remember. She sorted through Katie's medical records in her mind. "Katie went to the hospital, yes, just last summer for a tonsillectomy," she finally said. "It was in July. She was having frequent throat inflammations." Detective Mullins nodded while taking notes. "Could you tell me the details of that surgery? Which hospital and which doctor was in charge?" Elizabeth's memory came back. The tonsillectomy was performed at St. Joseph Children's Hospital. The originally scheduled doctor was an ENT specialist named Dr. Anderson. But on the day of the surgery, Dr. Anderson couldn't come due to an urgent matter, Elizabeth said quietly. And then she faltered. Suddenly, all the pieces began to connect in her mind. "My ex-husband performed Katie's tonsillectomy," Elizabeth said quietly. Her voice trembled slightly. "Your ex-husband is a doctor?" Detective Mullins's eyes sharpened. "He's a cardiac surgeon. Richard Clark. The chief cardiac surgeon at St. Joseph Children's Hospital." The atmosphere in the room changed. The female officer exchanged glances with Detective Mullins, and she immediately left the room. Detective Mullins's expression changed. This is becoming increasingly serious. There's a high possibility of a deliberate act by a professional. Elizabeth held her head in her hands. I can't believe it. Richard. But why? Was there anything unusual after the surgery? Detective Mullins asked. Elizabeth tried to remember. The surgery itself was successful without issues. The recovery was quick. But she frowned as she remembered. After the surgery, Richard contacted us more frequently than usual to check on Katie's recovery status. And, yes, he even came to our home once, saying he wanted to check because the surgical scar was a bit red. Katie, have you ever felt any pain or discomfort in your shoulder, not your neck? Detective Mullins asked Katie gently. Katie shook her head. No, nothing, but sometimes maybe my right shoulder would get a little hot. But it wasn't serious, so I didn't mention it. The female officer returned to the room. She whispered something to Detective Mullins. He nodded with a serious expression. Mrs. Clark, we've contacted the Tampa Police Department. They're taking this matter seriously and have begun procedures to issue search warrants for Dr. Richard Clark's home and hospital office. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I'll cancel our Chicago trip. We'll stay in Tampa until this matter is resolved. A wise decision, Detective Mullins agreed. Also, we've called in digital forensics experts to examine the nature of this device. They should arrive shortly. About an hour later, 2 technicians arrived at the office. One was a petite woman, and the other was a young man. They brought in specialized equipment and began analyzing the X-ray photos in detail. This is an advanced tracking device, the female technician, Sarah Chen, explained. It has the ability to send and receive satellite GPS signals. It can not only track the implanted person's location in real time but also record their movement history. Is such a thing possible? Elizabeth asked, trembling. Unfortunately, yes. This technology was developed for military and law enforcement purposes, but it's also available on the black market. However, medical knowledge is required to properly implant it, Chen answered. Her partner was operating a device that resembled a special antenna. I'm tracking the signal. He continued working with concentration. Found it. This device is emitting signals periodically, and the receiving destination is an IP address within Tampa City. Several hours later, they received a call from the Tampa Police Department. Richard Clark's home and hospital office had been searched. We've seized his computers and smartphone, the detective on the phone reported. According to the digital forensics team's initial analysis, we found specialized software for receiving signals from your daughter's device. We're continuing the investigation. Elizabeth and Katie had to stay overnight at a hotel. They were instructed to report to the Tampa Police Headquarters the next morning. Both mother and daughter were exhausted but couldn't sleep. Mom, did Dad really do something bad? Katie asked as she lay in bed. Elizabeth sighed deeply. We don't know everything yet. But if it's true, yes, it's a very bad thing. The next morning, in a briefing room at Tampa Police Headquarters, they received a report from the investigation team. Richard's computer had been thoroughly analyzed, and shocking discoveries had been made. Mrs. Clark, I'll share the forensic team's analysis results with you, Chief Detective David Morrison said. A database of your daughter's movement history was found on Dr. Richard Clark's computer. It appears he has been tracking your daughter's every move for the past 8 months. 8 months, right after the tonsillectomy, Elizabeth murmured. Furthermore, not only was your daughter's movement history found on his smartphone, but also detailed floor plans of your home. The placement of security systems, locations of windows and doors were all recorded. Elizabeth turned pale. He was monitoring us. It appears so. He also had records of your daily patterns, your times of leaving for work and returning home, Detective Morrison said. Dr. Richard Clark has been arrested while on duty at the hospital. He has been taken to the Tampa police station and is being interrogated. My ex-husband always knew where we were, that's how he could appear suddenly. Elizabeth's voice trembled as she realized the horrible truth. Last month, when I went to pick up Katie from a friend's house, he appeared saying he was just in the area. And a few weeks ago, when we were at the shopping mall, he said he was there by coincidence. That was no longer coincidence, Detective Morrison said with a severe expression. A few hours later, the results of Richard's interrogation were communicated. He has admitted to implanting the device, Detective Morrison reported. However, according to his claim, it was to protect his daughter. Protect? From whom? Elizabeth couldn't contain her anger. In his words, her mother is trying to keep my daughter away from me. I have the right to know where Katie is, he answered calmly. That's absurd. Elizabeth exclaimed. I have never denied his visitation rights. We think so too, Detective Morrison agreed. More seriously, his computer contained information about your new romantic partner, your bedtime, and even your daily routines. Dr. Richard Clark's obsession appears to have reached a pathological level. Elizabeth was speechless. She was stunned, overwhelmed by a mixture of anger and fear. She couldn't believe that the husband she once respected could do such a terrifying thing. How can we remove that device from my daughter's body? She finally asked. We've already contacted a specialist surgeon. Tomorrow, a removal surgery is scheduled at a medical facility separate from St. Joseph Hospital, Detective Morrison answered. That night, in their hotel room, Elizabeth and Katie sat quietly. Mom, what will happen to Dad? Katie asked in a small voice. He will receive an appropriate punishment according to the law, Elizabeth answered, hugging her daughter. But now, your safety and health are the top priorities. Let's remove that device and return to a normal life. Though she said this, she knew that this event had forever changed their lives. The waiting room at Memorial Grove Medical Center was decorated with soft colors and peaceful paintings. Elizabeth sat in a stiff chair, absently flipping through a magazine but not reading a single word. Her heart was full of thoughts about her daughter, who was in the operating room at this very moment. Katie's device removal surgery was scheduled for 3 days after Richard's arrest. During that time, Katie had 2 sessions with trauma counselor Dr. Lin Chen. The first session was tense, but through Dr. Chen's gentle and patient approach, Katie had begun to open up little by little. Katie, do you remember the day you had your tonsillectomy? Dr. Chen asked gently. A little. Katie answered in a small voice. I arrived at the hospital, and a nurse dressed me in special pajamas, and then Dad came and told me everything would be okay. Then. She frowned. Then it gets fuzzy. I think because of the anesthesia. Did you notice anything different after the surgery? Katie thought for a moment. My throat hurt. But the nurse said that was normal. And. She faltered. My right shoulder hurt, but Dad said it was because I was in an awkward position on the operating table. According to Dr. Chen's report, Katie had a gap in her memory under anesthesia, which may have been intentionally created. This suggested that Richard had sufficient time to implant the tracking device during the tonsillectomy. Now, Elizabeth was waiting for the operating room door to open. About an hour later, Dr. James Sutherland appeared wearing blue scrubs. Mrs. Clark, the surgery was successful, he smiled reassuringly. The device has been completely removed, and there is no damage to the surrounding tissue. Elizabeth sighed deeply with relief. How is Katie? She's coming out of anesthesia. You'll be able to see her in about 30 minutes, Dr. Sutherland said. Then, lowering his voice, he continued, I examined the device in detail. This is a military-grade tracking device. It is not available on the general market. It has advanced encrypted communication capabilities and a very long battery life. He took out a small plastic container from his pocket. Inside was a coin-sized metal device. I thought you might want to see it. Elizabeth accepted it with trembling hands. This small device had changed their lives. How did he obtain this? That's a subject of police investigation. Probably through the black market or medical equipment supplier connections, Dr. Sutherland answered. The device will be handed over to the police as evidence. That afternoon, Elizabeth took her daughter home, and the next day, she met with a family law specialist, Margaret Owens. Owens was a reliable woman in her 50s, a highly reputable lawyer in the field of children's rights protection. Let's organize the charges against Richard Clark, Owens said, holding a pen. Assault, stalking, child abuse, and medical ethics violations. Furthermore, considering he abused his position as a doctor, we can add abuse of authority. I want him to spend time in prison, Elizabeth said in a trembling voice. And I never want him near Katie again. That's achievable, Owens nodded. The evidence is overwhelming. We'll also apply for a complete review of the custody agreement from your divorce. In such circumstances, courts are not uncommon to completely revoke visitation rights. A week later, a preliminary hearing was held. Elizabeth sent Katie to school and attended alone. In the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom, Richard was brought in wearing prison clothes, handcuffed. His once dignified and confident posture was gone, his complexion was poor, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His lawyer applied for bail, but the judge immediately refused. The defendant has abused his knowledge and skills as a medical professional to commit a highly invasive and illegal act against a young child. Furthermore, the defendant possesses a passport and there is a risk of fleeing abroad. The bail application is denied. After the preliminary hearing, a statement was issued from the hospital. The director of St. Joseph Children's Hospital, Thomas Harrison, announced that Richard had been suspended immediately. I can't believe what he has done. Richard was a respected doctor, Director Harrison told reporters. His actions are contrary to the fundamental medical ethics and completely incompatible with our hospital's values. The safety and trust of patients and their families are our top priorities. Richard's colleague doctors were also deeply shocked. Some told reporters in interviews that he had been very dedicated to his work and compassionate toward patients. However, there were also voices saying that he occasionally showed strange obsessions. Dr. Clark sometimes wanted to know abnormally detailed information about patients' post-operative recovery, a nurse who spoke on condition of anonymity said. We thought it was his perfectionism, but now thinking about it. Following her lawyer's advice, Elizabeth petitioned for a review of the custody agreement made at the time of her divorce from Richard. She sought to revoke all of Richard's contact rights, and the family court provisionally granted her petition. Katie's safety is the top priority, the judge said. Until the results of the criminal trial in this case are out, Richard Clark is prohibited from any form of contact with the child. 3 months later, Richard's criminal trial began. The courtroom was packed with many reporters and spectators. This case was featured not only in local media but also in national news. Headlines like "The Dark Secret of a Respected Doctor" and "Custody Battle Abusing Technology" were prominent. The prosecutor's opening statement was powerful. The defendant, Richard Clark, abused his expertise as a doctor to implant an illegal tracking device in his own daughter's body. This act is a violation of a child's physical autonomy and a grave betrayal of parental trust. Richard's lawyer tried to defend along the lines of excessive parental concern. My client's behavior was certainly excessive, but it was because he was genuinely concerned about his daughter. After the divorce, his time with his daughter was significantly reduced, and out of a desire to ensure her safety, he made this misjudgment. However, that claim lost its persuasiveness in the face of the weight of evidence. The prosecution presented vast data recovered from Richard's computer. It included detailed information about Katie's school schedule, friendships, and even Elizabeth's romantic relationships. On the third day of the trial, the results of a psychological evaluation were submitted. Richard was diagnosed with clear signs of obsessive personality disorder. The defendant shows a pathological desire to control, testified the psychiatrist who conducted the evaluation. He felt a need to completely understand and control the movements of people in his world, especially those he thought he loved. The highlight of the trial was when Richard himself took the stand. Although he looked tired, he still tried to maintain his dignity. As a doctor, as a father, I had a duty to protect Katie, he insisted. Her mother limited my time with her, and I felt excluded from my daughter's life. By knowing Katie's whereabouts, I could be assured that she was safe. The prosecutor's cross-examination was relentless. Is what you call protecting embedding an illegal device in a 13-year-old girl's body and monitoring her 24 hours a day? The prosecution submitted records of monitoring Elizabeth and Katie's daily lives as evidence. Richard had tracked not only Katie's activities at school but also her visits to friends' houses, movies watched in theaters, and even the titles of books she borrowed from the library. This is not protection, but pure control, the prosecutor declared to the jury. The defendant did not love his daughter but treated her as a possession. After the final arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Elizabeth sat on the hard wooden bench in the courtroom, thinking about these nightmarish months. Katie continued counseling and was gradually recovering. However, the fact of her father's betrayal had left a deep wound in her heart. The judge looked sternly at Richard before pronouncing the sentence. The defendant, Richard Clark, is found guilty of first-degree assault, child abuse, stalking, and abuse of medical license, and is sentenced to 8 years in prison. Additionally, 5 years of probation after release is ordered. Furthermore, permanent revocation of his medical license is recommended. Richard listened to the sentence without changing his expression. His face was hard as stone, his eyes vacant. He looked at Elizabeth just once, but she looked away. As the judge left and the court dispersed, Elizabeth finally stood up. Her legs were still shaking. When she left the courtroom, the warm spring sunshine greeted her. A few days later, she took Katie home. "Is it over now?" Katie asked during dinner. "Yes, it's over. We're free now," Elizabeth hugged her daughter. "We can start a new life." That night, after Katie had gone to sleep, Elizabeth sat on the porch and looked up at the starry sky. It had been a long battle, but it was finally over. She had protected her daughter. Life ahead wouldn't be easy, but she believed they could overcome it together. The spring sunlight poured through the large glass windows of Tampa International Airport. Elizabeth received the boarding passes at the check-in counter and handed one to her daughter Katie. "Here, hold on to this. We'll finally get to Chicago this time." 1 year had passed since that incident. After Richard's trial ended and he was imprisoned, Elizabeth and Katie's lives were gradually returning to normal. And now, they were finally embarking on the Chicago trip that hadn't materialized before. "Same gate as before?" Katie asked. She was now 14, had grown a bit taller, and her expression was more mature. "Yes, what a coincidence," Elizabeth smiled. "But this time, it should be a more enjoyable trip." They checked their luggage and headed toward the security checkpoint. While waiting in line, Elizabeth remembered that day. How much her life had changed since then. Eventually, it was their turn. Elizabeth expertly took off her shoes and placed her valuables in the tray. Katie did the same. "Mom, are you okay?" Katie asked. She must have noticed that Elizabeth's expression had hardened a bit. "Yes, of course," Elizabeth rallied herself. "Just experiencing a bit of déjà vu." Elizabeth went through the metal detector first and passed without incident. It was Katie's turn next. She walked through the metal detector without hesitation, and no alarm sounded. "See, no problems at all," Elizabeth sighed with relief. Katie stared at the X-ray scanner for a while. "It's a strange feeling," she murmured. "This machine found that thing inside me that day." "Yes," Elizabeth answered quietly. "But it's different this time. If that day hadn't happened, the truth might never have come to light." On their way to the boarding gate, Katie said while looking at the planes outside the window, "I've learned a lot this past year." Elizabeth looked at her daughter. After that incident, Katie had continued weekly sessions with a trauma counselor. The first few months were difficult, but gradually she learned to express her emotions in words and deal with her fears and anxieties. "So have I," Elizabeth put her arm around her daughter's shoulder. That incident had also brought changes to Elizabeth's work. She became responsible for a series of books on privacy and safety at the publishing house, putting her own experiences to use. In particular, a book called Children's Safety in the Digital Age was well received and featured in national media. "My teacher said my experience might help other kids," Katie said. "So I decided to give a speech at the school's safety program." Elizabeth was surprised and at the same time felt proud. "Really? How long have you been thinking about this?" "For a while now. But I wanted to wait until I was ready before telling you." Katie smiled a bit shyly. "There might be other kids who have had experiences like mine. If my story can help." Elizabeth hugged her daughter. "You've really grown stronger." At the Florida State Prison, Richard Clark was reading a book in his small cell. The first few months after imprisonment had been difficult to adapt to, but now he was used to the prison routine and was known as a model prisoner. He was taking a correspondence course in medical ethics and was beginning to understand the seriousness of his actions. Each week, he met with the prison counselor to discuss his behavior patterns and thought processes. "I loved too much," he told the prison counselor one day. "Katie was everything in my world. I was afraid of losing her." "That's not love but attachment, Mr. Clark," the counselor quietly pointed out. After a long silence, Richard nodded. "I understand now. It wasn't love, but control." He had written letters several times, trying to apologize to Elizabeth and Katie. However, Elizabeth had taken legal measures and refused all contact from him. All his letters were stopped at the lawyer's office and never reached them. Richard eventually accepted that decision. He now participated in a medical consultation program within the prison, providing basic health advice to inmates. His medical license had been permanently revoked, but his medical knowledge was proving useful in prison. "What do you plan to do after your release?" the counselor asked one day. "I intend to find a path of true atonement," Richard answered. "I want to do something that benefits those I've hurt, to give back to society." However, he had vowed in his heart that he would never interfere in Elizabeth and Katie's lives again. He knew they had already moved on. And that was something he needed to do as well. From the window of their Chicago hotel, Elizabeth gazed at the magnificent view of Lake Michigan. For the next 3 days, she and Katie planned to visit this city's tourist attractions. "Mom, it's Michael on the phone," Katie handed over the smartphone. Michael Sullivan was a university professor Elizabeth had met 6 months ago. He was mild-mannered and considerate, and had built a good relationship with Katie. Their relationship had gradually deepened, and Elizabeth was feeling the joy of romance for the first time in a long while. "Thank you," Elizabeth took the phone. "Yes, we arrived safely. The hotel is lovely." "Katie?" "She's fine, hold on, I'll let you talk to her." Elizabeth handed the phone to Katie and smiled as she watched her daughter enjoy the conversation with Michael. A new family form was gradually taking shape. "Living my own life without being controlled by a control freak like him is a wonderful thing," Elizabeth thought as she gazed at the city lights spreading from the window. The night view of Chicago from the hotel room was breathtakingly beautiful. And the journey starting tomorrow would be filled with new memories. Having overcome past fears, they had finally gained their freedom. From the prison window, the view of the starry sky was limited, but Richard had still developed a habit of looking up at the night sky. After serving the remaining 7 years of his sentence, he would have to start a new life. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to learn from his mistakes and become a better person. "Elizabeth, Katie, may you be happy," he whispered. That was the only prayer he could offer.